From Rome to New Orleans, Translating the City, the Jesuit Missionaries and Their Participation in the Construction of Urban Fabrics by Dr. Frederick Conrad from Florida Atlantic University. Those familiar with Jesuit history might find this to sound very familiar. However, as I'm embarking on a larger project that I intend to gear toward historical fiction rather than academic publication, this presentation sums up a lot of my research interest over the years. Since my doctoral dissertation in the early 2000s, I have continued to look at different manifestations of a common phenomenon, and that is the influence of the Jesuits' educational system on literature, the arts, and urban planning, as all interwoven territories in which the effects of spirituality and pedagogy from the ignition methodology could show its marks. In parallel, I've also paid close attention to rebellious expressions from former students of the Jesuits who became their critics but continued to apply their methodology even through unconscious parodies. Rome is obviously the eternal city, and here humans can come to contemplate the interruptions and continuities of its artistic evolution. Layers of history and art were already present when the Jesuit order was founded, and Rome was later chosen as its headquarters, a logical choice for a branch of Catholicism that wanted to stay close to the Vatican. Here in Rome, the future leaders of the Society of Jesus were always exposed to one of the best preserved and most unique urban fabric in the world. The city has given them inspiration to participate in the construction of other cities around the globe, where Jesuits have also built their missions. Always at the heart of the city's human complexity, Ignatius of Loyola did not only have in mind a fundamentally urban ministry for his order, but he also recognized the potential use of the images of Roman antiquity. As Gavin Bailey points out in his analysis of the first images of Jesuit art in Rome, quote, more important was the desire to link present-day Catholicism with the early church. The frescoes were concerned with celebrating the role of Rome and the papacy as the legitimate center of Catholicism and the inheritor of the glory of the antiquity. End of quote. But as the Jesuits would participate in the construction of other cities in the colonized world, they would also seek to always reconnect the present with the past in the same fashion they had defined in Rome. There was a need to develop other centers for Catholicism to secure its position in a continent that could see the greatest development of Protestantism. Other Romes, other bastions were to be built to stand against the waves of Lutherans and Calvinists who would populate the colonies in search of religious freedom and expansion. I am a firm believer that the urban planning of a city gives essential directions to the arts and the humanities of its inhabitants. The immediate environment and the palimpsest that a city becomes while accumulating a history are influences on any creative minds and cartographers alike. The Jesuit missionaries traveled the world to participate in its mapping. When they first arrived at the future site of what was become New Orleans, the city was standing at the border of Mexico and Florida, as this map shows here. This unusual perception of the Mississippi River and its estuary does somewhat remind us of how Rome was often perceived and depicted with the Mediterranean estuary of the Tiber to its west. New Orleans, on the other hand, is a still fairly recent city, even though in the United States it is considered to be one of the most historic places in the continent. And its exceptional preservation in comparison to a lot of other cities that have eliminated landmarks of the past still makes it, to this day, a city where travelers can also contemplate layers of history on a much smaller scale than Rome, obviously. But many times, cities are built with a vision of reproduction, hence the many cities that carry the adjective new in the name. Little in common as the Louisiana metropolis, not the capital of state, by the way, with Orléans, France. As we know, its name is more to do with the dynasty it was dedicated to. Yet, new in the United States now seems to define its opposite and has become an indicator of old, rather. On the surface, Rome and New Orleans already have a lot in common, starting with their cultural history and heritage. Obviously, their music scene, the opera for Rome, the jazz scene for New Orleans, their renowned cuisine, their body of water as essential, the Tiber for Rome and then the Mississippi River for New Orleans, their diversity, their architectural heritage, their festivals and carnivals, their traditions, their romantic and picturesque nature for travelers around the globe, as well as their summer humidity that forces people into a slower pace. But most of all, the strong presence of Roman Catholicism is what lays at the foundations of this list of similarities. And in the case of New Orleans, one could even argue that this presence is fundamentally Jesuit. The Catholic calendar has defined the rotation of cultural manifestations in both cities. Interestingly enough, it has also made both cities carnivalesque places par excellence, in the Bakhtinian sense of the word. According to Russian philosopher and literary critic Mikhail Bakhtin, the carnivalesque moment comes to reaffirm the established order by inverting it temporarily. Rio de Janeiro and Venice, of course, might be more famous than Rome and New Orleans for their extravaganza, but not for their connections with the Catholic Church and its central powers. The carnivalesque nature of both cities serves a constant reaffirmation of the institutional powers that hold them together as urban fabric. The unleashing of energies is part of a constant process of cleansing and penance. The more city dwellers are exposed to sin, the more they develop a capacity to resist it, or the alternative, to become part of its economy. Sin and salvation work in symbiosis in the fevers of that carnival. Sin is indeed part of the urban fabric that constitutes both cities. We might forget that Rome was once perceived by many, and can still be today, as the great harlot of the apocalypse, the harlot of Babylon, for a long time, and that traces of depravity are eternally visible in the city to this day. Unlike Paris, that enjoyed an almost complete reset of its urban fabric under Napoleon III and Baron Haussmann in the second half of the 19th century, Rome has kept bits and pieces of its entire architectural history. New Orleans might not currently enjoy the title of the most sinful city in the United States since the rise of Las Vegas, but it once did, and has a longer history of prostitution than the Nevada metropolis. When it comes to prostitution and drug consumption, for instance, the cities have seen parts of their urban fabric grow according to the economy of these quote unquote sinful activities. Let us remember that when Ignatius of Loyola and the early Jesuits surrounding him established their global headquarters in Rome, they did not choose the safest area of the city. As a matter of fact, the mother church of Jesuit was built in an area of Rome that was then famous for its prostitution. In the gospel, obviously, Jesus had taken the defense of sex workers several times, and orders of the church were already offering some level of care to them. In an effort to help the sick, Loyola had tried to join the Franciscan order, before his university studies in Paris, and was hoping for a life of close contact with poverty and sin between the rural and the urban world. Unfortunately, the Franciscans rejected him. Once the Society of Jesus was approved by Paul III in 1540, however, the order defined a clear preference for the urban world, and preferably in areas of the city where sin is most visible and prevalent. Thomas Lucas, a Jesuit himself, confirms Loyola's attraction for the most sinful parts of the city. Quote, Ignatius was the first founder of a major religious order in the history of the Church to locate their headquarters in Rome, and the first to opt deliberately for complete insertion of a religious order's works and residences in the center of the urban fabric. End of quote. Page 23. He also signals that one of the first mission Ignatius established in Rome was the Casa Santa Marta, a halfway house for sex workers who would be reconducted to a monastic life integrated in urban life. The Jesuit soldiers, as they define themselves, intend therefore to form an army against the orders of corruption in the city at their very springs. In our times, Pope Francis, a former Jesuit, has paid even surprise visit to the sex workers of Rome to reaffirm the Church supports and help. As they did with other cities, the Jesuits contributed to making New Orleans a theater stage for the confrontations between vice and virtue, between sin and salvation, between nature and culture. The city is a stage that is often shaken and needs to be constantly developed or rebuilt. People are more at risk in the urban fabric. The death drive, as defined by Sigmund Freud, is, in general, perceivable at a higher rate in cities with a reputation for gambling, prostitution, drug, and political corruptions. The proximity of their inhabitants often leads to the promiscuity. The presence of the Jesuits at the crossroads of human depravity and sin has always been a very controversial topic, just as much as their influence on the urban institutions. In sum, the missionary who has been trained on this dangerous stage has lived already an intense exposure to sin and evil and can be shipped to another part of the world to translate this experience into a mission of evangelization. With the flourishing of missions in developing cities of the New World, the Jesuits wanted to educate their students with the immediate surroundings and their challenges. Always pioneers in legal and medical educations, cities would in turn benefit from their presence in most distressed areas, as they would not refrain from being in direct contact with crime, disease, and social tension. In addition, the cities themselves were threatened by invasions, whether by other human populations or by natural catastrophes. Cities like Rome and later New Orleans are scarred by many dark episodes in their history and are culturally proud of their survival. The Jesuits would embody that Roman resistance and bring from their previous exposure to the eternal city that knowledge and the wisdom of soldiers who have survived several wars against the enemy, whether it is nature or a human enemy. Taking themselves very seriously as soldiers of the Counter-Reformation, the Jesuits sought to stay close to the growing institutions in city centers. Because they were often a network hosted by a Jesuit university, they connected the social, the political, the medical, the philosophical, and the educational spheres, making sure that they would all perceive how each of these layers in the city had or could have a resonance on the other. They sought to be connected to all the roots of the city rising close to the estuary. In the case of New Orleans, they translated their experience of an age urban fabric, the Roman one, to infiltrate all the areas of the urban world,
including and most especially in the areas where prostitution, gambling, and crime was prevalent. The first Jesuits passed by the site of the future city while on an exploration mission down the Mississippi River in 1700. These were French Jesuits, then returned to France to find the new regime of Louis XV extremely favorable to their development and expansion in the New World as well as in Europe. So 25 years later, a new team of Jesuits under the leadership of Nicolas Ignace de Beaubois returned to the site of the new city to participate in its educative, spiritual, medical, social, and philosophical construction. The first permanent Jesuit residence was founded and became a new headquarters for the growing region of Louisiana. Both cities were founded as strategic hubs of trade and commerce, attracting a diverse population that included merchants, sailors, soldiers, but also prisoners and missionaries. Very soon, New Orleans was plagued by the same predominance of male energy that the Jesuit had seen and experienced in the streets of Rome. The demand for sexual services in this growing urban center was high. In addition, French prisoners were brought to work on the construction of the city, and along with them arrived the first wave of sex workers. And quickly after, a whole section of the city that was named later on in the 20th century Storyville saw the emergence of brothels to cater to those needs. Along with sex workers and the buildings for their practices came syphilis, a plague that Jesuits had already seen in Rome and were trying to control, especially in female sex workers, with halfway structures such as the Casa San Marta that we've mentioned before. Manfred Bartel, one of the biographers of Ignatius, suggests in his comprehensive biography of Loyola that such compassion for those infected with the disease derived from his personal experience with it and of it. Whether this is speculation or not, his order was one of the only Catholic orders to take care of those suffering from syphilis. In sum, the new city quickly reproduces the dynamics of the old one, and the young Jesuit missionaries shipped to New Orleans from Europe were all of a sudden right at home in their urban ministry in the streets of New Orleans. Somewhere between two provinces that the Jesuit already conquered, Mexico and Florida, the new city of New Orleans promised to be just as exciting of a liminal space, a social theater, a laboratory for salvation and education that the Jesuit already found in Rome. Of course, many more parallels could be drawn between the construction of the two cities and how one translates the other into a new site. My particular interest is to highlight the necessity of a network of sinful activities for the missions to flourish and expand. This growth is of a social political nature, evidently, and demonstrate how efficient the Jesuit educative strategies turn out to be in this phase of history. As we can observe in literature, cities are also texts that can become written over the course of centuries. And many times, a city is the reproduction, continuation, and translation of another. I hope this presentation was a fair introduction to these inter-urban correspondences that we can observe in those cities by the river. If Rome once sought to be the new Jerusalem, New Orleans can take pride in being a bit of a new Rome. Thank you.